just an introduction to the Qira'ah as a discipline. When people study it as ilm, what's the approach and the introductory principles. And then we'll conclude with some examples of Qira'at differences, inshallah. And I think, alhamdulillah, we're doing good on time, so we'll have time for questions and comments throughout the presentation and also at the end, inshallah. But before we start this section, does anybody have questions that relate to the previous two sections? Or comments or objections? Yes. What was the first word?
So, has there been any modifications or modifications of the structure that we have now, like house? Are there any additions? Have there been any outside of what they did at that time?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, has there been any modification to the system? So the answer is generally no, there hasn't, but so we spoke about reading, qira'ah, and riwayah, right? I hope this is not going to complicate things. There is a third layer that I will talk about, which is a tariq, right? A tariq is basically a sub-riwayah, if that makes sense. Like it's a transmitter of the transmitter. So you see how the web of isnads go from, let's say, from the Prophet or the Sahabi, all the way to the Imam of the 10, one of the 10, and then between the Imam of one of the 10, and there are two transmitters, right? For each transmitter, you can keep breaking down other students. Obviously, it's an ongoing process of transmission. Things got very stable by the time of the transmitters, of course, but also the transmitters had their own different modes of recension from their teachers, right? It's not one style. Let's talk about Hafs since it's familiar to most of us. So Hafs, when we say you can read mad and munfasil, I mentioned the example earlier with 2 harakas or 4 harakas. These are called turuq, right? Some of these might be called awjuh. The word wajh and tariq have different technical meanings, but in general, the tariq here is another systemized way of reciting within the riwayah itself. So it has to do, I can give the example of, again, it's commonly known for a famous tariq through Hafs is if you do Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu instead of the mad, then the 4 sakatat, the iwaja, maqadina, balghara, manraq, the 4 sakatat that you do this, small pause without reading, you didn't do them. You say ولم يجعل له عوجا قيما. You didn't do عوجا, then you say قيما. That's the kind of famous sect in Surah Al-Kahf, for example. These are called turuq. It's all called Hafs, but within Hafs there's tariq, and also a lot of different names. The tariq Quran. I think someone was also talking about, you hear the term qira'at al-ashr as-sughra wal-kubra, right? So like the minor 10 and the major 10. It's a literal translation. The minor 10 is you take in one slide for each one of the 20 transmitters. The major ones is you go deeper into the rest of the turuq for every transmitter, which gets a lot. By the way, Hafs, for example, is one of the most complicated because he has a lot of turuq. So when you go to the turuq styles, he actually Hafs has turuq that you will never imagine the Hafs yourself. Okay, if you want maybe a surprising example, you study tajweed, we know that idgham في اللام والراء بدون غنة, right? You didn't do غنة. You didn't say من لدنه, right? He does that in some of the turuq. Not very common, not a lot of people study that, but it's there. It's a valid style of reciting that. So the idea of turuq, so back to your question, these are not new things. But the systemization went through some kind of very, very slight modifications of the technicalities. I give the example of qalun. You have 5 major ways of reciting qalun based on, again, the mad, mim al-jam, and these things. Can I mix and match? Can I not? That's actually a debate. It continued being a debate for a long time. Some mashayikh until today would say, you know what, read whichever way, just be consistent. Some mashayikh would say no. Because if you do you do it mathematically, it will be more than 5. If you can mix and match these 4 things mathematically, meaning you have mad, and again, it's very about technicality here, but just a quick example. If you have mad, you have mim al-jam. Mim al-jam means say alayhimu, just an example. And then if you have a tawrah, how you should recite it, and you want to basically combine a style between these, be a mad or not, between taqlid or not, between sulat mim al-jam or not, you'll come up with more than 5 styles total. Some people say no, it's only 5. Some people say no, you can just do any of the styles, but be consistent. So this is a debate that continues to happen. It's just about very, I don't know if they call this modifications, but very slight opinions or debates on the tarkib, on the combination of some of these facts.
And is someone allowed, or not necessarily allowed, but is it frowned upon to mix, Qur'an or riwayat? Like if someone has difficulty saying a certain ayah and else they take it from wahb or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that not seen as part of culture?
Yes, it's question 2. So can I combine turuq, for example? Now the qira'at will have an answer and fiqh will have an answer. In qira'at, no. Because that's a discipline, that's a ilm, that's a style, that's a sunnatun muttaba'a. It's qira'u kama ulimtum, read as you were taught. You need to be very specific with your style. That's why you read it actually. Before you start, I'm going to read Hafs and Hasim min tariq al-Shatibi. Like you've got to be very specific about the style you're reciting. Right? That's the qira'at answer. The fiqh answer, fiqh is not concerned about the systemization of turuq that much. It will tell you, if you're not messing up the composition of the Quran, it's not haram. Maybe it's not preferred, but it's not haram. That's what fuqaha talk about tarkib al-qira'ah. That's a famous question as well. Can I mix and match? You would tell you, if you know the question of talfiq al-fiqh as well. Can I mix Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and that common question? So usually the fiqh will tell you, if you're not making up a new hukm, then you're good. Right? Meaning that I'm going to, in wudu, there's one madhab that considers bleeding not to break your wudu. Blood is najasa, but your wudu is fine. And another madhab that if you touch a non-mahram, then your wudu is fine. And the third madhab, if you touch a private part, then it's fine. He's like, okay, I'm going to do all of that. And then go pray. No, it's like now we're making up a whole new scenario that none of the madhab approves. Right? Even though individually, every madhab or every act has one madhab that supports it. Is that example clear? So the idea of like mixing different opinions to come up with the way, the legal test for that using the language is I would say, okay, whatever you did now, you go and present it to each madhab. If each madhab individually told you your wudu is batil, then your wudu is batil in time. So if you go to Hanafi, it's like, no, you're batil because whatever you left. If you go to Shafi'i, no, you're batil because you touched a non-mahram opposite gender. If you go Shafi'i too, for example, or some opinions in Malikis, no, if you touch a private part, your wudu is broken. If you can't find a madhab that tells you your wudu is fine, then your wudu is not fine. But you say, no, but this one individually, that madhab said okay, and this one I need the act. He said, okay, you can't do that. Another famous example in marriage. Some madhab are lenient with the guardian for the woman. Some madhab are lenient with the mahar. You can get married and talk about mahar later. Some madhab are lenient with the witnesses. He said, okay, I'm going to get married without any of that. I'm not going to have a mahar identified. I'm not going to have witnesses. I'm not going to have a guardian. Is that marriage? No. None of the four madhab will tell you it's a valid marriage. That's called talfiq batil. That's called invalid. Literally mixing and matching. You're just like taking one opinion from each one, and then you're making up a new scenario that none of the four schools will have. So if you apply that to the qira'at, the logic is pretty similar, right? I'm going to use Ibn Kathir and another qira'ah in an ayah. If you're going to change the i'rab that will change the meaning of the ayah, that none of the qira'at conveys that meaning, then it's haram and wrong. Let me give you an example. There is the ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ فَتَابَ عَلَيْهِ. Right? That's the most of the Quran. Adam, alayhi salam, received words. Just translate it literally for the sake of the example. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ. Adam received words from his Lord. Ibn Kathir reads it. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ. He switched it active and passive, right? So here you would say, it's very difficult to translate the Quran translation, or the translations translate it as Adam was received by words by his Lord, or from his Lord, something like that. I don't like this translation, but it's a way to flip the active and passive, right? So he just switched the object and the subject of the sentence. Okay? Can I do his qira'ah in one of the two words and another qira'ah in the other one? No, it's not going to work. Because the grammar will be messed up, basically. So I'm going to say, I'm going to take the subject of the verb sentence from Ibn Kathir, but the object will do it according to another. It's not going to work. The grammar will be broken. And now you're literally making up a new Quran in this way. So that particular way will be wrong. Aqim will tell you it's wrong. A Qira'at person will be, it's entirely wrong. Because like you're literally corrupting and distorting the meaning of the Quran. But if we talk, طبعا in the words it will become more sensitive, but if you talk about mixing up awjuh in terms of mad, I read this ayah with mad, and then the next ayah I did different mad. Qur'an should be wrong. Go back and fix your qira'ah. In fiqh, it's not haram, but it's not the appropriate way of reciting the Qur'an. So that's your question about the tarkeeb of the qira'at. Of course, the general advice is, of course, you have to be consistent. But we say you have to, we need to know, am I wearing the fiqh hat or am I talking as a Quran teacher? These are the different perspectives. Any other questions?
Someone's reading in a qira'ah and he makes a mistake with a different qira'ah. Are you supposed to correct him if it's in salah? Going back to his original qira'ah?
You don't have to.
You just read it.
Unless, again, if it really corrupts the meaning. Because even so now, if you talk as a fiqh, in fiqh you're not supposed to be picky with the imam anyway. So in the fiqh, they don't encourage people to correct the imam for every mistake, unless the mistake really changes the meaning of time. But missing a small kind of a letter or it's second person, maybe third person, the meaning didn't really change. Even if it's not a qira'ah, you're not. First of all, nobody said you're obligated to correct. That's not. Almost nobody said that. And then, should I correct him or not? Maybe, but it's not really something that I very encourage. Why? Because fuqaha will prioritize the nazm and the sequence of the salah to be just consistent and without interruption, more than just fixing these small, minor kind of mistakes.
You talked about the different tariqas, Qalun, Jaheen, Lana. Is that from Qalun himself, or is that from Nafi'? Is that Qalun, or is that Qalun just how is that
It's both. It's a good question. It's both. So it goes through Qalun, through Nafi'. Because every one of these teachers, they're not teaching only one style. They're teaching multiple styles, or multiple combinations, basically. So they have, so Nafi', for example, he said, I read to 70 teachers in the Medina. Quran. He studied Quran with 70 teachers in the Medina. It's a large number. And then he said, every harf, he used the word harf, meaning every variant I read is what at least two of them have agreed on. It's a beautiful statement because it gives you his methodology. How did he come up with the qira'ah? He come up in the systemization sense. He said, okay, I read to all these people, I synthesized what I read to them, and I'm going to affirm my style, or my combination, my ikhtiyar, based on at least two people, or maybe of course more, what they have actually agreed upon. That will still come up with variants, and he will teach these variants to people this way. Qalun has some, Warsh has some, and they do the same thing. And also read to other people too, but the main tariq is through Qalun and Nafi'. Okay, so we'll continue inshallah, and again, please feel free to interrupt me at any point and ask questions inshallah. There's a very big discussion on the idea of tawatur, and it sometimes becomes a little bit confusing. Again, we spoke about tawatur earlier today. That means mass transmission or wide transmission. A lot of people are transmitting texts in a way that makes the idea of them fabricating this almost impossible. The idea basically of having conspiracy, that all these people have been agreeing to say there was a surah called Yasin that is recited this way. It's impossible, because it's thousands and millions of people have been reciting it in a very specific manner for a very long time with uninterrupted chains of transmission from the first source, the Prophet ﷺ, until today. So it's very unlikely, if not impossible, to say that was just somebody made it up and convince all these people to keep basically in a way in the same exact way. The idea of the dissemination of the knowledge of the Quran that much from the very first time, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it really guaranteed that. What makes some people today confused about tawatur is that we confuse tawatur across different disciplines. So tawatur is more discussed, or maybe until recently, people are familiar with it in hadith. Hadith is much more limited in terms of the number of people involved, right, compared to the Quran. So in hadith, we classify hadith to be there's ahad and there's mutawatir. Again, ahad, a fewer number of people translating the text. Then we say it's sahih. When you say hadith sahih, you're not as definitive about its authenticity as you say about the Quran. It's authentic, and we believe the Prophet ﷺ said that, but in terms of epistemological certainty, I'm 100% sure he said it exactly in these same words. It's not the same level of the Quran, right? We know in the Quran 100% that Qul huwa Allahu ahad, he recited it this way. But in hadith, is there a 1 or less percent of a word that was maybe different or, yeah, that's possible, and that's not a problem. Because that we got the overall idea. We got the 90 something percent that he actually said it like this, and we got the practice of the people and the Sahaba and the Amal and the Fuqaha, but yani, the deen was preserved in a very kind of, not just okay, in a very clear manner from this perspective. We didn't even need to verify beyond that. For Amal, for practice, you didn't need to verify beyond that. But for Quran, the primary text, the primary source, no, we need to make sure that every word is actually going back definitively to the Prophet ﷺ. So that's that what becomes a little bit confusing is that when we say tawatur, some people ask, okay, is every word in qira'at, or has every word of qira'at been mass terminated? And that's a big question today, that not really, maybe not all of them. Are you sure that all of it, like, now we can talk about turuq that maybe you've never heard before. So like, was that very common and now it's not anymore? One way of looking at this is, are we talking about two things? The words, the examples that we gave about arjulikum, arjulakum, fatabayyanu, fatathabbatu. Are we talking about these examples? Or are we talking about the imada and the mad and the meme and these things? These are two different categories. What I called earlier, usul and farsh, right? The principles of qira'ah. This is tajweed rules, and farsh are the individual variants, the words themselves. That's one distinction. The other distinction, are you asking me about the phenomena of mad? Or are you asking me about the 2 harakah and the 5 harakah and the 6 harakah? Are you talking about like these like assigned harakat of how much you prolong a letter? Or are you talking about like the idea of mad in general? We have to look at it this way. Because we have a lot of scholars who say the concept is mutawatir, the idea of mad that is based on the way that where the letter is positioned in the word, muttasil, munfasil, and all of that, yes, that's mutawatir. The 2, 3, 4, 6, and all of that, not necessarily, and doesn't have to be. And we should be comfortable with that. That's not a problem. You tell me, okay, if in Hafs an Asim, if you إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين, right? How many styles I can do in doing that waqf and nasta'in? 3. What are the 3? Okay. Okay, so sukoon, raum, ishmam, these are styles. But how about if you add the arad and sukoon? And how many? You add the 3. So 2, 4, 6 harakat. This is how much total? 6. Okay, if you multiply that with raum and ishmam, there's a trick there. Yeah, so hold on, before we do the math, there's a trick there. Because the raum doesn't work with all of them. Ishmam does. With the 2, yes. Right? So now you come up with 7. That's not qira'at in the general sense. This helps. This is what everybody of us read. You can pause and nasta'in in 7 different ways. Now I tell you, okay, I want you to prove to me that 2 harakah of nasta'in with raum has tawatur all the way back to the Prophet. I don't have to. I don't have to. How we explain the ahruf, the concept is there. You prove to people the idea of raum. And raum, by the way, for those who don't know, if that you do like you with a very, very kind of low voice or like almost not loud at all, you just indicate to the audience that there's a dhamma here. So you say nasta'in, just like you really give it like a quarter dhamma there, right? And the ishmam is just how you form you shape your lips. You say nasta'in. So if you don't see me, you're not gonna know that I did it. So these are like just very technical. Again, it has nothing to do with the meaning of the ayah, right? So when we ask the tawatur, we get sometimes very sensitive, like, okay, we need to prove because we're taught that every word in the Quran is based on tawatur. That's correct. But nobody really ever claimed that every wajh and every mad and every, like, opening a book of tajweed. How do you do mad al-munfasil? How many harakas? How many harakas for mad al-munfasil? 2 or 4. Is there more? No, for Hafs. There's 5 too. Right? So you open any book of tajweed, you find that muttasil, like a sama, right? Like you can do 4 harakas, right? And you can, for maybe if any of you doesn't know the haraka, it's just like the units of prolongation of the letter, so how long you should do it. So, with ta'ala books of tajweed, you can do 4 or 5, right? How many of you went to a shaykh that had him do 5 consistently? Is it common? But it's there. Literally every book of tajweed has that. It's not common. It's a wajh. It's one style. Again, it's a very specific, very not tangible point at all. So again, the point I'm saying here is the idea of tawatur is the text, of course, is mass transmitted. The ideas of mad and imala and takhfif and all of that is tawatur. There's no really debate about that. The idea or the question of these very, very specific styles. By the way, if you go to other qira'at, you find even more awjuh. So the example of Nasta'in and 7 awjuh, your qira'at like Hamza, in some words, he will posit a word with 12 different styles. Right? Sometimes it actually goes beyond that. So the question itself is kind of absurd to ask, I want you to prove that every single one of these goes back to the Prophet with a limited number of people doing it. It's not really necessary. That's one. 2, by the way, even by tawatur, yes, they are, all the way to the Qari. So that question becomes tricky when you ask between the Qari and the Prophet. So from Hamza all the way to now, millions of people have been reciting that. That's not a problem. We have today a lot of people reciting like this, right? Because we have millions of Qur'an students in Quran. Now, if the question usually becomes, okay, between that century or 2, between the Prophet and the Qari, can we document that? Maybe we can't, but it doesn't mean it didn't exist, but maybe we can't. Because the number of Sahaba who were teaching people, the dynamics were different as we could tell from the introduction. The question is all of that Quran? Yes, it is. And are we talking about different, the word variance is actually tricky, and we use it a lot. Variant readings is tricky because it makes it sound as there is a text and there are variant texts, or there is a different editions of a text, which is not true. We're talking about a multiformic text. It's one text. It's still one text, and that's actually why the title of the program, Unity in Multiplicity. It's multiple, but it's one, which is very unique. It's not like we have different rendition or different percentages of the Bible. That's not the same at all, because the Quran is one text. It's read slightly in different ways. They're still given the same meaning, very harmonious meanings. They're not actually contradicting at all. So that's the idea of, are they all Quran? Yes, they're all Quran. And again, the question of tawatur sometimes becomes a little bit confusing maybe for some people, specifically in the first century, because the data that we have might not be specific to every single style we're reading, and I'm saying we don't even have to establish that. There's that kind of legal hypo that Imam Nawawi rahimahullah was asked if somebody to swear by talaq, by divorce. It's kind of a funny question. That Allah spoke the Quran in the 7 qira'at. So that's the question. What would that oath be valid, or would that be a broken? Because if it's not true that the oath is broken, means the wife will be divorced. That's the question. And he said no. It's fine. The oath is not broken. Meaning that yes, all of these are divine. All of these are Quran. There's 7, but it's one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did reveal that to the Prophet, and that goes back to Hakada Nazala. This is how it was revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Now the idea of preferring some qira'ah over the other, I spoke about it briefly a couple of times. So again, it's common in tafsir that you find discussions between qira'at and doing tafdeel, doing like this one is better or stronger or more eloquent, or has an additional meaning that is better than the other one. None of these discussions pertains to rejection of the text itself of the Quran, or rejection of the Quran, not the authenticity of the text of the Quran. This goes back most likely to verifying the qira'at themselves, because there was a big filtration process. Some qira'at were not true. So maybe some discussions, the author is saying, this is not a valid qira'at. That happens, and that's that qira'at themselves were doing that, of course, all the time. Or the author is saying, it's Quran, and I have a problem with that. But I feel like from a grammatical point of view, the other qira'ah makes more sense here in this context. That becomes subjective. You remember the example of Arhami or Arhama? That's a debate. It doesn't have to end. Which one is stronger in a grammatical sense? Because we agree that both exist in Arabic, but which one is stronger? It's very, not very, like in a way subjective, because you're looking at it from a grammatical point of view. Not necessarily from like, is this, or not even, is this from the Quran or or not. And the third element is rhetoric, is balagha, which takes different ways of assessment. Is this more eloquent in the context of this ayah or not? Does this address the point in the same, like as powerful as the other qira'ah or not? That's also kind of a rhetorical assessment. Again, it doesn't really stem from doubting the authenticity of the qira'ah. Only one exception to that is you will still find in some books of tafsir, scholars of tafsir are actually rejecting qira'ah. And that's one of two categories. Whether the qira'ah itself is really not one of the 10 qira'at, so that's an easy one, or the author got it wrong. That might happen. You find famous mufassirin, especially early ones, who sometimes reject the qira'ah because to his knowledge of the regional school of Quran, and keep in mind the qira'at took time to evolve in the standardized sense. The debates about authenticity kept happening for some time. To their knowledge, this is not a valid qira'ah. But he was wrong. That's okay. He wasn't very familiar with it. It's like you today heard of other qira'ah you never heard about before. I mean, we shouldn't, of course, rush into making judgments. But he said, I'm not, maybe he wouldn't say that literally, but they're not familiar with the qira'ah, they're not familiar with that style. He said, okay, the other one is the one I know, so I will give preference to the other qira'ah. That's also a possibility. I'm not saying this never happened, it did happen. But most of the time, it's really about, again, looking at grammar, looking at some historical accounts behind the qira'ah, looking at the rhetoric and the balagha and the different features of every qira'ah.
If it's like if they're not disagreeing with authenticity of it, isn't the Quran itself evidence in Nahu and Lugha al-Arabiya in general? Like is it the Quran the lens of what you look at Arabic from too anyways?
That's a good question. So yes and no, because the Quran came and the Arabic language is really stable. That's why the main miracle of the Quran is it struck the people who speak the language as something very different from any other text. So it doesn't make sense that the text that came in a stable language would contradict the conventions of this language. So people always we say confessionally as Muslims that yeah, grammar comes from the Quran. Yes and no, because the grammar has been there already. It's not Quran is not the source of grammar, but the Quran confirms the grammar, and the Quran struck the people of grammar as even way more eloquent and well structured than even their knowledge of grammar in a way, right? So there has to be an assumption that there is no way they contradict each other. That's the answer to this question. What happens sometimes is like the example of Surah An-Nisa, Qira'at Hamza. Some people are not familiar with it, or some people are against doing the construction of Jabr in this way, say that's not strong way. But did it exist? Yes. We have poetry about it. We have tribes who actually use that style. It wasn't common. And that's one of the beauties of the Qira'at is that you would use uncommon styles sometimes. Right? The other controversial example, grammatically. وكذلك زينا لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم. قراءة ابن عامر, it's a very complicated grammatical point. Also, he was criticized a lot by mufassirin. Saying like, oh, that grammatical structure doesn't make sense, it's difficult, it's not really the proper structure. You find like mufassirin later, like Zamakhshari and later scholars of tafsir would criticize qira'ah from a grammatical point of view. But their assumption is Quran came and the Arabic language is stable and it should conform with that. So that's, but it's not, I know when you phrase it, you feel like, oh, that's Arabic control. No, it's not really about control, it's about conformity with conventions that people know and here an example of how scholars frame the idea of preference. So Imam Makki ibn Abi Talib is a famous Qur'an scholar. He said scholars might prefer what both Asim and Nafi agreed on, since the readings of these two Imams are the most credible, authentic, and eloquent. So here he's saying the most. That means there's preference happening here, right? He's not negating the authenticity of the rest, but he's saying these were adopted by a lot of people. And then he said, after these two in eloquence, rank the readings of Abu Amr al-Nisa. And you'll find opinions that say the other way around as well. So it's not, that's what I meant by subjective. Imam al-Sakhawi, another scholar of Quran as well, he said, if the variant acquires high standards of eloquence, compatibility with the Mus'haf, and the approval of the majority of Qur'an, it will be the chosen reading for most of them. Again, that indicates there is that space of giving preference to some readings, but we read these statements in a kind of a particular context. So the way to look at it, mufassirin or linguists, the favoring of qira'ah, they're looking at rhetoric, they're looking at eloquence, they're looking at meaning sometimes, they're looking at popularity among Muslims. These are the perspectives they are looking at. And then the question here that Imam Ibn Ashur, the famous modern mufassir, he said, if we agree with the idea of sometimes comparing qira'at in this sense, does that imply that some qira'at will be stronger in proving the miracle of the Quran than others? Right? Because if you see this one is more grammatically kind of, I don't know, powerful or rhetorically powerful, that means the other one doesn't contribute enough to the miracle of the Quran, because the miracle of the Quran primarily is based on the language of the Quran. And he had the interesting answer. He said, what's the point of evidence? When we say the Quran is inimitable, Quran is unmatched, what are we describing here? Where does exactly the miracle lie?
Is it the meaning?
The meaning, okay. And what else? The grammar, okay. What else? Or can you elaborate more on these two things?
How it's like impact people.
How it impacted people. What else? The what? Hmm. It's very concise and to the point. Okay, beautiful. What else? The scientific miracles. Okay, I was just going to say nobody mentioned that. Okay, yes.
The challenge to replicate it, to make something like it.
Okay, but this is the challenge. But what? Oh, so you're saying the fact that people lost the challenge is that it's a miracle? Okay. Yes.
The order and it was structured.
The order and the way it's structured. Okay.
The idea of like, something called, sorry, I just forgot. I'll say if it come back to me.
Okay, sure. Any other thoughts? The way and the fact that it's memorized throughout time. Yes. So most of the answers have to do something, have something to do with the language, right? Because really the main point of the miracle was it's Arabic. These people knew Arabic, right? And it is not. So what makes the Quran very different from the previous miracles of other prophets is that it still sounds human, but it's not human. So try to compare the miracle with all the other miracles that we know from the Quran, other prophets, right? Like the story of Musa alayhi salam, it's very clear. Like you can't really, there's no much to process, right? He threw their sticks, came snakes. He threw one, it ate the snakes, right? There is no like. It's very clear. It's very supernatural. It is something that is almost impossible for people to think about any other ritual. Ibrahim alayhi salam literally walked into fire and came out. Okay, like they broke the laws of physics, right? Like it's just, it doesn't, that's why it's kharq al-'ada. It's like it breaks the norm that people are habitually accustomed to. When it comes to Quran, it's not really the same. It did break the norms, but not in the same manner. And by the way, that one makes some Muslim scholars early on to get in big debate about where exactly is the miracle. Some of them couldn't have an answer, or couldn't have a direct answer. Some non-Sunni, for the most part, scholars, felt like it's not, we can't say it's the language. By the way, including great people of language in history. Like they were like masters of language. In early Muslim history, they said, we agree that language is special, but it doesn't have to be a miracle. Why? Because it's like people can potentially do something like that. So they're more struck with, why didn't people do it? Right? And usually the argument is, why did they choose to go to war instead of riding a sword? Right? You know what is even more striking? Why didn't they even try? We don't actually have really records of people even trying. At that time at least. There are some stories later on that some people tried. Like during the time of the Prophet in Mecca, they didn't even try. And we're talking about the greatest poets and the greatest khatibs and the greatest writers. They didn't even try. So there is something they felt internally that like we can't. What is that thing? There's a famous controversial theological opinion that some Initially, was some non-Sunni scholars, they said, no, the miracle is not in that. The miracle is they lost the internal power of writing something like it. And Allah forced them to lose it. And a lot of Sunni scholars got very angry at this opinion. So I was like, what do you mean? Like they were forced? Because the implication of this opinion is that had they been given the ability back, because they had it ready. So that opinion said they were actually able to write like the Quran. But Allah prevented them. It has a funny name called the sarfa. Sarfa literally means sarafahum. Allah has prevented them from being able to produce something like the Quran. Meaning you were forced. And meaning, if Allah didn't do that, you could have possibly written something like that. And it sounds like an odd opinion, and it is kind of odd, but honestly, the logic of the opinion, it has some point, which is, it's really striking because it's the same language. It uses the same poetic images that these people are familiar with. It actually uses images that like poets before the Quran have already used. They know that this is a way to describe an animal, this is a way to describe the mountains. Like they knew these poetic images. Quran used them again in a more profound way. Exactly how, they couldn't tell, they couldn't challenge it, they couldn't produce something, they were just fascinated. That's why it's like, is it magic? Not really. Is he quoting somebody else? Not really. It's like, every time they keep like mentioning other things, and the Quran documented all of that, right? They said magic, they said it's sihr, said it's like those kahana, the soothsayers before the Prophet. They even said he were taught that secret. And he quoted somebody else. And the Prophet ﷺ, and the Quran, Allah tells him to tell those people. And they kept saying he's a sadiq al-amin, right? He's trustworthy, he's the honest, everything. Once he became a prophet, all these accusations all of a sudden came. Right? The sihr and the magic and the majnun, he's insane. Like all these, and he's possessed by jinn, all these accusations. And the Quran says in a beautiful way that the Prophet should tell them, فَقَدْ لَبِثْتُ فِيكُمْ عُمُرًا مِنْ قَبْلِي. I've been living amongst you guys, come on. Like really, this is the meaning of the ayah. Like really, like you're accusing me of all these things, and I haven't left Mecca all of my life. I've been here with you. I'm born and raised here, right? For 40 years, I was very trusted. I was very trustworthy. Everybody likes him. Everybody trusts him. Then all of a sudden, I'm insane and I'm possessed and all of that. It doesn't really make sense. They said, yeah, but somebody else who taught him from that particular city. And the Quran exposes him. He said, لِسَانُ الَّذِي يُلْحِدُونَ إِلَيْهِ أَعْجَمِيٌّ وَهَذَا لِسَانٌ عَرَبِيٌّ مُبِينٌ. You're not even good at making stuff up. If you want to make something out, just like get your facts straight. Like try to, like the person that you identify, he doesn't even speak Arabic. Or at least his first language is not Arabic. So you're saying the one he's quoting, and this is a great Arabic text, according to you guys, this is a great Arabic text, and you're saying that he quoted from somebody who doesn't even speak Arabic. لِسَانُ الَّذِي يُلْحِدُونَ أَعْجَمِيٌّ. That's not an Arab person that you're saying he got it from that. At least find some other person to make this accusation sound at least logical. So the idea of being struck with the light of the Quran, it really struck Muslim scholars also afterwards to identify. It wasn't, by the way, it wasn't an easy debate for Muslim scholars to come up with an easy answer. Quran is mu'jiz because of 1, 2, 3. It actually took time to develop that theory for Muslims because like everybody's feeling it, but you know that famous Supreme Court judge that he said like when you see it, you know it. It's something that is experiential. It's a very bad analogy. Apologies about that because it was about something very odd. But anyway, so they felt it's something experiential, and it's something that I can feel it, but I can't point it out. And you see all the stories that we know, Walid ibn Mughira, like he wrote the Quran, and he described it in a very beautiful manner to his people. And the many Meccans who were very struck by the language of the Quran. All of that lead the Muslim scholars later on, when they wanted to answer the question of what makes the Quran special, they come up with, that's why when I asked you the question, you thought about different things. Because it's difficult to identify like this one simple answer to all of that. But if we will come up with a simple answer, it's the language. It's the way the language is structured, the way the Quran blends rational arguments with talking to the emotional and the psychological side of human beings. Quran is not a logic book, it's not a philosophy book, it's not a science book, it's not any of that, but it's all of that at the same time. So that's really the unique part about the Quran. So I went on kind of this tangent to come to the idea of if we take in some qira'ah over the other in a particular tafsir context, are we contradicting what we're saying about the Ijaz? Because we're still saying all of that is Quran. So when you think of the Ijaz, you think of the core point of balagha and rhetoric is to situate your audience in a proper way. What makes a person an eloquent person is their understanding of the audience. Right? So for example, you guys are very bored now, and And obviously, I'm not a good speaker, but like I'm not paying attention to how much exhausted and bored you are, right? That's not balagha. That's I failed that test. It's the way that's the way you assess a speech to be eloquent or not, from at least the Arabic rhetoric perspective, is you literally define it مطابقة الكلام لمقتضى الحال. Situating your speech exactly in a way that fits the state of the audience. That's what balagha is. The idea of I'm going to use rhyming, I'm going to use that particular word, that image, that comes secondary. That's the next step. Okay, what's the best analogy I use for you? What's the best rhetorical image that is relevant to your culture, relevant to your language? That's step 2. But step 1, who are you first? And how should I situate my kalam for you? And that's why if you study balagha, you find that there is audience that is neutral to what you're going to say. You guys didn't know me. I don't know you. You didn't have really any kind of much background about me. And I tell you, it's raining outside. Sure, you don't have a reason to think I'm lying, and you don't have a strong reason to believe me as well. That's called a neutral audience, right? I don't need to also emphasize that because we're not too invested, basically, in having this kind of connection, right? But that's one level of audience. Another level of audience is a person who is having some level of doubt about the credibility of the speech, right? You have a bad kind of perception or image, or you heard something negative about me. So everything I say is going to be like, okay, you need to verify, you need to check. You're not going to take me as a credible source for what I'm sharing. So now if I want to see it's raining outside, I have to do something extra beyond that. I have to do, wallahi, it's raining outside. Now, okay, now maybe I should take him more seriously. Like now he's using qasam, right? Or he's using mu'akkid, he's using like whatever articles of emphasis. And then maybe we're actually coming from very different backgrounds and we're beginning to debate. So we're already kind of opponents on this topic. Now I will have to use even way beyond just saying wallahi. I will have to actually, okay, I have to show you, I don't know, my weather app on the phone, or give you a picture, or we'll go outside and verify. Like we're going to have to do a lot more than that. The Quran uses its rhetoric in these different styles. That's why when you see a qasam, when you see a ta'heed in the Quran, when you see sometimes the alternation between first person and third person, the Quran uses that based on the ayahs. So if this is the core of the rhetoric and the core of the inimitability, the i'jaz of the Quran, qira'at is not going to affect that. So that's a very long way to answer this question. The qira'at will not really affect this idea because the qira'at comes in the second and third step, which is which word I use, which image I use, right? It's not about the audience, it's about just different ways of saying it. As long as I'm able as a qira'at to convey the point in different ways, the i'jaz stands as is. It doesn't really affect the i'jaz much. Again, I hope that wasn't confusing. That was a long tangent on this point. And the i'jaz is a whole different topic when it comes to the understanding the wahi of the Quran. Now to switch gears to fiqh. Fuqaha also did that. One funny kind of research exercise I did a while ago was to find out what the founders of each madhab favored when it comes to qira'ah. I found some of them have clear statements, some of them not really. So I mentioned earlier Imam Shafi'i. What was the qira'ah he liked or he read? Ibn Kathir. He said that. So that was a kind of an easy finding. He said, qira'atuna qira'atu Abdullah ibn Kathir. Again, he means I favor this qira'ah. That's more obvious than tafsir. Not to be a kind of rejecting, of course, other qira'at. I think it's just like this what I learned, this what I read. And I like it not just in a subjective sense. It's his isnad, it's his connection to the Prophet, how to read the Quran. It's Mecca, it's not just like a random city. Like it's a very strong isnad, a very strong qira'ah. And the Arabic of this qira'ah is very kind of high level of eloquence and grammar. So that's Imam Abu Hanifa. What was the qira'ah of Imam Malik? Nafi'? Why?
He said that was the qira'ah that the people of Medina used to read.
Yes, because he said that's the qira'ah people of Medina recited. And literally the title of Imam Malik is Imam Ahl Medina, right? He's the Imam of the people of Medina. So you can see that it's pretty obvious or kind of expected that he likes this style. He actually says qira'atu Nafi' sunnah. Now you say like, does he mean the other sunnah? No, that's not the point. He's saying like, this is the qira'ah I learned, this is the isnad I have, this is the connection to the Quran. You have to read these statements in this particular way. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I couldn't find like a one statement for him. There are actually multiple statements from him and from his son, given like different attributions to him. Sometimes he'd say, I prefer the qira'ah of the people of Hijaz. That's a little bit broad than just identifying one. Because that could be Nafi', that could be Ibn Kathir, that could be Abu Ja'far, right? And sometimes he would say that qira'at of Abu Amr is like fasiha, for example. It's eloquent, it's strong qira'ah. Right? Now we understand the framework of how to read these statements, right? So he has like, and sometimes I remember also, I think he mentioned Asim to be like a qira'ah, he reads and he considers to be a good qira'ah. Imam Abu Hanifa, of course Abu Hanifa is an early, by the way, Abu Hanifa had ikhtiyar himself. So that qira'ah, there's qira'ah Abu Hanifa. Actually, basically every one of the four had a qira'ah. Because again, I showed you Shafi'i, he's actually earlier than the Rawat ibn Hafiz. So if you want to reconstruct his qira'ah, you can, in a way. But Abu Hanifa was preserved more. It's considered to be shadh, but he had a qira'ah. So actually, I'm interested in this topic. I had written a paper on this, and Abu Hanifa specifically. So I counted the variants he had from the books that document the qira'ah al-shadh, and then compared it with the Kufa qira'at. Very minimal differences. You find like a few words extra that like I can't find in the qira'at. That means his qira'ah is Kufa qira'ah. It's basically Asim and Hamza. Like it's basically between that tradition. That's why the idea of regional schools of Quran is very important. Any qira'ah that even is considered to be shadda, it will go back to these schools. The fact the differences are very minimal. But there's no school of law that just said we're going to adopt this qira'ah to be the official qira'ah. No, really. As I just mentioned, it just happened. Nafi' Malik makes sense, Kathir, Shafi'i makes sense. So this is how it works. But even the later fuqaha of each madhab didn't say, okay, khalas, Shafi'i did Ibn Kathir, we're all going to do Ibn Kathir. We didn't really do that. It's not, there's no representative qira'ah on behalf of the legal school. One other way of doing preference in fiqh is to consider urf, to consider custom of people. And that's very important. Because you find, مثلا, in the Hanbali madhab, not just Hanbali madhab, but it's an example that is there in the books. You say it's makruh. Now there's the fiqh coming in, right? It's makruh to recite a qira'ah that people are unfamiliar with. And see the level of accuracy. You can't say it's haram, it's a qira'ah, right? It's Quran. And you say like there are other external factors that would influence the hukm of this act in this particular context. Right? Now it has become common in the States for the last, I don't know, maybe decade or less, that in Taraweeh you hear different qira'ah. That wasn't common before, right? Before it was pretty difficult to recite different qira'ah that people are not familiar with, even in many Muslim countries actually. It wasn't very common. I remember growing up, I haven't seen, I'm not that old, by the way, but like it wasn't very common. It was like very, very small circles where you can find that. Now it's everywhere. I think Wallahu part of that is the live streaming of prayers and the recording of qira'at that became extremely common in the past maybe 20 years or so, right? Like now every Ramadan, every masjid has a live stream. Most masajid have live streams and different qira'at. The last few years, Jami' al-Azhar in Egypt, they stream the Taraweeh every year with almost all different qira'at. People are familiar with it, people know the idea. Maybe not every Muslim knows all the qira'at, but the idea of ikhtilaf, the idea of differences, it became common. Before, it would confuse people. Right? When I first started reciting qira'at in Taraweeh, I would do in Taraweeh, I would do in Tahajjud, like a small number of people, and give disclaimers and you explain, and you're very kind of worried that people might misunderstand. Now it became, people are more, still you get these questions, some people are not really familiar with that, but it's not as strange as it used to be. And another example, and subhanAllah, maybe things will change. Until today, I find it difficult to recite in Hamza in Taraweeh. Like last two Ramadans, I recited many qira'at, but when it comes to Hamza, I just would become like, it's going to be difficult for people. Maybe 2 rak'ahs in Tahajjud, there are like 1-2 lines of people behind me. Okay, you know some of them already. Huffaz, Qur'an. Okay. But like it could be different. There are some dialectical differences that will strike some people. And the point is not to confuse people. One point is to show people the beauty of the Qur'an and the different ways of reciting the Qur'an and to connect back to that tradition. At the same time, you need to be wise in the way you do that. So they said it's makruh, and he actually mentioned the Imam Ibn Muflih, al-Hanbali jurist. He said the Imam of the masjid needs to be wise about these things. If he's going to cause confusion, if he's going to cause fitna, if he's going to make people question him or question Quran, question one another or fight, then do it. It's not, you don't have to do that. Just like recite what is common to you. You know, I don't know if this is a very accurate analogy. You know when people ask which madhab I should study? Right? And of course, you should study Shafi'i. But if you're not going to do that, then usually like do what's very common in your maybe culture, your family, like, right? That should be one of you, not the only maybe deciding factor, but that should be one of the factors. Sometimes I feel like there are people who just like want to just go against the norm somehow. Like no, I'm like, okay, all my culture is whatever. Maliki, I was like, no, I just want to be Hanbali. Why? there are valid reasons. I'm not saying there aren't, but sometimes just like being, the idea of just sticking to culture is not bad. I think sometimes it's always good to stand out, but not really. It's not all the time. If it's gonna cut, if you really want to serve the community that you live in, and most of the community is doing their ibadah and worship and all of that in a particular way, why would you do something different if you're planning to serve in that way? If you have other academic objectives or research, sure, again, it's your choice whether there's no obligation to do a particular madhab, but eliminating that as one factor, like I don't want to do what my culture or my family does, it's not necessarily everything all the time. It really depends on that, because eventually if you want to give back and serve that community, you should also meet them where they are, basically, as a community leader or religious leader or something like that. So the idea of makruh is you kept it makruh because it's subjective based on the situation and based on the context. He actually mentioned the same Imam Muflih mentioned something beautiful. He said, I understand we said it's makruh, right? But sometimes it's the opposite. It's a mustahab. It's recommended if your objective is to read a qira'ah, see how much attention you pay. To switch qira'ah to another qira'ah that has one letter extra to get more thawab. That was a very kind of beautiful kind of point. He said, some qira'ah says sari'u and other qira'ah says wasari'u. Right? So one has one. It's like one letter. So like, yeah, it's 10 hasanat. Why not? Right? You can just like, maybe if that's your intention, you get actually thawab for doing that. And he mentioned that example, saying, we're saying makruh as a principle, but it's not real. Like, again, it's Quran. Nobody will tell you that Salah is valid, obviously, and it's Quran. Nobody can tell you to not read Quran. Just be sensitive to the context where you are reciting the Quran. Now we're the qira'at, where I had planned to develop a map for this, but I didn't really have enough time. But just to give what we have, at least in books of history of qira'at, until the 5th Hijri century, or 11th, again, Hijri Common Era, this is what we know to be the most common qira'at. In Kufa, Iraq, Hamza replaces Hafs and Shu'bah. So Asim with his Hafs and Shu'bah were more common first. That was very early. Hamza actually replaced it very fast. So if you go back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, I taught about him, and then his students, and then Asim comes like next generation, then his students, Hafs and Shu'bah. So that, like, you talk about maybe a couple generations, and then Hamza. Not during his time, Hamza, like a little bit later, he replaced Hafs and Shu'bah. Hamza was contemporary of Abu Hanifa, by the way. They actually met and studied together. And Imam Abu Hanifa used to tell him, you basically, you made us in two things, qira'at wal fara'id. Fara'id is the laws of inheritance. And imagine somebody like Abu Hanifa saying, you better than me in inheritance. That means like, he was a faqih too, of course. It wasn't just, these were just like not transmitters, he's memorizing and transmitting. He were scholars of many other disciplines as well. In Basra, Yaqub, we mentioned that before, it stayed there for a long time. We have attestations, historical statements that the main mosque in Basra, people used to recite this Quran. Sham ibn Amr, that was, of course, famous since Abu Darda, as I mentioned, the Sahabi, all the way until Abu Amr took over in Sham. Egypt, I mentioned Warsh, stayed there for quite a bit from his time until the 5th century, so approximately 4 centuries reading Warsh. And then these are like regions we have documented. And then you have now, I mentioned Abu Amr to be very common. So Duri Abu Amr was very, very common. It was in Iraq, then Hijaz, Yemen, Sham, Egypt, Sudan, East Africa. A lot of these countries or regions were actually reading in the qira'ah of Duri, specifically Abu Amr, all the way until the 10th century, 16th Common Era. And in Egypt, it even lasted longer, until the 12th century Hijri. That's 18th century, right? It's like 2 centuries ago. So Duri was very common. And then there was a beautiful prediction that, by the way, this Shu'bah is not the Qari, this is Shu'bah bin Hajjaj, the Hadith scholar. That's very early scholar, it's like early on during time of Ahmad bin Hanbal and Imam. He once said, and that was considered to be a prediction he made. He liked Qira'at Abu Amr a lot. And he once told his students, Abu Amr's reading will have the strongest isnad, like basically ever. So that was very early. Al-Jazari, probably 4 centuries later, he said that was a karama, that was like a kind of almost a miracle for Shu'bah to predict that. Because really, he said today, it's 4 centuries later, and we can see that Abu Amr became the most dominant and the most common qira'ah. And then Al-Jazari is a famous authority, of course. He said across Sham, Yemen, Hijaz, and Egypt, we do not find anyone teaching Quran except the reading of the Quran. So of course, these are massive regions of the Muslim world. In today's Muslim world, one of the kind of what a lot of people agree on, and Ashur mentioned that in the tafsir, what we know today, basically, Nafi', specifically Qalun in Tunis, Libya, and some parts of Egypt. That's Sheikh Ibn Ashur's account. Sheikh Ibn Ashur died in 1973. And then Nafi' through Warsh, some part of Tunis, some parts of Egypt, Algeria, and a lot of the kind of far West Africa and Sudan. Asim, we expect that. It's very, very dominant. Almost all of the East. And it also includes most of Egypt, India, Pakistan, Turkey, Afghanistan. It really includes most of the Muslim countries since a little bit pre-modernity until today. Asim is that word. Study house is the most common. Another question that we spoke about earlier, and Abdullah accused the Ottomans to be the reason why Hafs is the most dominant, and that's the word industry, as they say. Just like everybody, the Ottomans forced people to read Hafs. It's not really forced people. So they tried to make it a little bit more nuanced than this. They said the Ottoman Empire did adopt the Hanafi madhab, right, as like the official madhab of the state. So if you're going to be a judge, most likely you need to be Hanafi to get like at least like a higher level judge, right? That's one thing. And then a mufti in an official position, you need to be Hanafi. They didn't cancel on that, but like that's basically. If you want a modern analogy, it's like U.S. is common law, right? You want to be a lawyer, you need to study common law. Just it's really as like it's pretty analogous. If you want to study civil law, good for you, but you're not gonna find a job, right? Because there's no civil law. Maybe in Canada there is in Quebec, for example, but in the U.S. you can study civil law as you want, but you need to go to another country that practices that takes like civil law to the legal system. Something pretty similar, but actually Muslim state was more pluralistic in this. You would still find a job. It wasn't that bad compared to today, but I'm just giving a kind of an idea of why when we say the appointing judges to be Hanafis. So if you want to go to law school and you want to find a job, you want to study common law. You want to go to law school and you want to, I know Hanafi people would really be mad at me saying this, and you want to get a job, you want to study Hanafi. I'm not saying all Hanafis wanted to be Hanafis to get a job, but it is what it is. So he said because of the dominant legal culture was Hanafi, so they made Hafs, but I honestly didn't like this kind of argument because who made the assumption that Hanafis read Hafs? I agree that, again, Ottomans endorse Hanafi madhab, absolutely. That why are we making the assumption? I just mentioned that they read Hafs, they read Asim, so why not sure? And they read Abu Amr, and they read Abu Amr. So we don't have a historical record that says they also made like a, it's called a faraman, they made like just this kind of decree by the Sultan, by the Khalifa, that, by the Sultan for the Ottomans, that everybody needs to read Hafs. I mean, that didn't actually happen. So if there was some kind of enforcement, it didn't happen to the Quran. That's one thing. The other thing, Ibn al-Jazari, the very famous Quran scholar that almost every one of us knows, and our ijazat go back to and all of that, he lived during the Ottomans. He never mentioned something about it. I think he would have mentioned that if that was a big deal. And he traveled, like he went to Turkey, he went to, I think, Sham, the Middle East in general. So he traveled and he had a lot of students, and he went to Egypt, he had a lot of students. He never mentioned that there was a policy by the Ottomans that everyone needs to read Hafs. He wouldn't, I was going to say differently. Most likely would have pointed that out if that happens during his time. Number 3, let's survey qira'at works that were written during the Ottoman Empire and see what we will observe when we read them. So you find that Abu Amr was still common. During the Ottoman time, Ottoman time, of course, we're talking about centuries, Abu Amr was still common. It didn't really decline in favor or and replaced by Hafs. Declined in small regions, declined a little bit in Yemen, in Sudan, some other African regions, but it didn't like kind of decline across the board. Abu Amr stayed popular in Malaysia, Abu Amr stayed popular in Yemen, stayed popular in Indonesia, stayed popular in Iran, India, Turkestan. These countries that during the Ottomans, they stayed reading Abu Amr, they didn't decline. Again, if there was such a policy, we would expect these regions that are going to shift to Hafs. West Africa, of course, there's a Maliki influence of these countries. Nafi' was there. West Africa, that nobody could invade it. It remained Maliki, remained Nafi'. Like it stayed like that pretty consistently. And Also, the Ottomans didn't have much control there, so maybe if you still want to make the link between the Ottomans and the Hafs, it wasn't like under the direct kind of oversight. You have the Seljuks, right, who came within and after the Ottomans. These share the same culture. The Seljuks like have very similar cultural things in common between them and the Turks, and or the Ottomans, I mean, and they did not adopt Hafs. We don't see that also in the works of the qira'at that were written at that time. And again, Hanafi school itself didn't have like one official qira'at. You have Hafs and you have Abu Amr, as well as you have Hafs in general. Some people have a different theory about the dominance of Hafs, which is interesting. Do you think it's the modern trends of the Mus'haf that made Hafs very popular? The way we printed Mus'haf in the 20th century, this is what made Hafs to be very dominant. You agree or disagree? Agree. You want to elaborate more, or?
The reason is because it was very dominant in the sense that it was a shadow law. Like everyone has that specific script, and it's usually because of the mass printing. You'll see a lot of people who might not study the Quran or go through the traditional process have that script itself. So Hafs's presentation would be the most popular one for Quran, and that over-dominates people who study it. And they might take another of that like in the honorable.
Okay. Yeah.
Some of the, like, we have the Islamic print, and then we have the other, like, Pakistani print. I don't know if it's called version.
Prints or editions. Yeah.
Prints.
Oh, prints.
Are they meaning that, the types of print, or are they meaning print in general?
No, the modern prints, which is circulation, and like Masahif are in circulation. And printing had more consistent. So before people just like copy scribes themselves, and now like with modern technologies, now we can print hundreds of thousands of copies and just disseminate them.
I would say no for two reasons. First, primarily, Quran is an oral tradition. You say, I learned my teacher who was taught by his teacher. And so you have like the oral chain rather than straight like I read from the Mus'haf.
Yeah.
Second thing is that literacy didn't really climb that high. Literacy rates.
Oh, okay.
Didn't really climb that high for those.
Didn't?
No, for like reading at least. I don't think like it climbed that high until maybe say 100, 200 years ago.
Talk about the level of literacy. How many people didn't
Like reading rates
go up in the 20th century?
didn't go up until kind of like I don't know, say like 20th, 19th century.
Yeah, but that's the same century we're talking about too.
This is like the Ottomans are like 14th.
No. We're not talking about the Ottomans. We moved off from the Ottoman point to now the modern 20th century prints of the Muslim.
Oh, I mean,
The what?
oh, you mean like today?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to give a kind of more specific kind of example, there is some literature on the royal editions, called the royal edition in Egypt, 1925. There is, some people say 25, 26. This is one of the most, not the most famous modern prints of the Quran. But a lot of the famous prints that came afterwards basically were modeled after that, in terms of the rest and the style and everything. And then when we did it twice, there was some kind of revision that happened a few years later. And then when now Saudi started doing the Medina Mus'haf and Libya started doing Libya Mus'haf and Mus'haf, we were all basically modeled, for the most part, on the Egyptian royal edition. So it became the gold standard for modern editions of the Quran. And when they did it in Egypt, and there are a couple of interesting books on this topic, they chose Hafs. We didn't have a lot of historical context why, right? Because, so people say, yeah, it caused the dominance of Hafs, but can we try to find out more information on why did the committee, you know the names of the committee members, and it was commissioned by the king. Why did they choose Hafs? To my knowledge, I'm not sure they don't mention that. Maybe it was ijtihad, like, you know what, Hafs would be easy to just kind of, well, not easy, but like maybe more kind of accessible to people. I don't know. It looks like there was obviously some level of ijtihad there, and they chose that. And then a lot of specifically the Middle Eastern copies of the Mus'haf, the also circulation was very huge, right? It was like now you have years later, Azhar has an official copy, and now they send it all over. Then now when Saudi Arabia started printing the Mus'haf, it went literally across the Muslim world everywhere. And these are Hafs. And if we use, I was going to talk about the literacy argument, to say like now people read more, maybe people don't have like that much connection through oral transmission only, now just people want to read the Quran, they read it Hafs, they pronounce Hafs, so that's why they become dominant. This is what this argument is actually about, is that how the Quran was printed and circulated. Any other questions or thoughts at this point? Yes.
Do we have like different mushaf that like written specifically for like different kirat, or people
Today,
just
yes,
use-
there are many.
but they are not very common as the Hafs one? That's what you're saying?
Depends where, like, if you're in Morocco, you find a lot of Qadi Quran in Wash. In Libya, you find a lot of Mus'hafs and Qadi, so it depends on the dealer.
Okay.
But now we have these Sahih, digital and physical.
But another reason why Asim was so popular, or Hafs specifically, is because his Islam was the strongest. Like you mentioned before.
I didn't mention his name.
Oh, I thought you said before that.
I said the Shatibi said that he is mutqin.
Yeah.
Shatibi described him to be like a very kind of mutqin in his like tajweed and stuff. But was his not the strongest?
Oh.
Allahu Alam.
At the time that the Egyptian Mus'haf made the Hafs Mus'haf,
Mhm.
was there any fitna between people that they're like wrote the Quran, or like so that they tried to make one thing so that they could unify all the Muslims?
No, that's a good question. Not that we know of. It's an interesting story because we have some contextual background about it, but not much. Like we know the committee again. We know the khattat, the person, the calligrapher who actually did there was a famous khattat in the Masjid al-Buwad, and he wrote a short book on his style of writing and the Rasm al-Quran, all of that. So we have some of these contextual kind of background, but like what's happening in society, I'm not sure. You know the book, the name I mentioned, Shadi Nasser, the Harvard professor. So he has that book, The Second Canonization of the Quran, on Ibn Mujahid. So he considers, again, the first doesn't have a book on each one, but the first is Uthman's, second is Ibn Mujahid. He's been saying that for a long time. I think he's going to write another book, or maybe he's writing it already. And he mentions that in this book too, that there was a third canonization. And according to him, it's the Vedic Mus'haf. He considers that to be the third kind of stage of the canon. I feel like it's a kind of a stretch, but he didn't really publish the whole thing, so I don't know if he has other data. But he has a diagram, for example, in this book that says first, second, third, and he has the third to be the Ottoman Mus'haf. Another interesting thing, I'm sure all of you know Sheikh Masarawi. He has announced, I think, a while ago that he's going to do the fourth or the third, I forgot the number he used, Jam' of the Quran, by recording the Quran in all qira'at. So it's an audio collection of the Quran, or an audio preservation of the Quran, Jam' Sawti. So he's going to do a full khatna for every, I think he's still working on it, do a full khatna for every riwayah for the 20 riwayat. I don't know why he called it Jam', but maybe he's going to maybe publish or write something about that. But yeah, this idea of like the continuous preservation and canonization, it's kind of attractive to different objectives.
And how do we understand the Urdu script, right? The same way that
The what script?
Urdu script, like the region has like a very specific script that they use. They use a script that is very
Yeah.
different if you're not used to manuscript or manuscript. But theirs is specifically also in Hafs. How do we then explain Hafs' dominance in that region's scripture, script? Without mentioning the Muslim. So it's done at very different times
Yeah.
and done for different reasons.
I honestly, I don't even think this one is a strong argument. I don't have an answer. I really don't have like a strong answer to why Hafs was dominant. Maybe I would consider some of these to be contributing factors, but I don't see any of these, even the print of the Mus'haf, to be the reason why Hafs became dominant. Because you're right, the timeline of the print between India and Egypt was different. As you mentioned, the script was different. Still, Hafs is dominant, so there are definitely other factors. And I'm also not 100% negating the Ottoman kind of influence, but I don't think it was massive. That's the one that I'm pretty comfortable to say, like, it's not a very strong influence. The print maybe is more influence, but it's not enough to do that. And maybe it's, again, it's like, think of the fiqh, right? What makes madhab fulan dominant in this certain region? You can think about a lot of kind of factors that have to do with availability of teachers, availability of books and print as well. Jobs, as I mentioned, like about judges and and fuqaha, etc. Okay, so to do qira'at as a discipline, just to cover a couple more points and then we group examples, inshallah. Every discipline you study, we have something called al-mabadi al-ashara. If you study fiqh, if you study tafsir, if you study aqidah, any ilm has 10 introductory principles, or kind of the 10 essentials. It's just a beautiful framework that scholars developed to tell you, before you study something, you need to know what this thing is. So it gives you what's the definition, why do you need to study this, what's the hukm from an Islamic perspective to study that, what are the major topics of this discipline, etc. So they developed that for the qira'at as well. And now we have a technical definition of what the ilm al-qira'at is, and they define it, for example, as knowledge of the exact manner of articulating the words of the Quran and their variations as attributed to each of the transmitters. You see, when it comes to technical definitions, they're very technical. And I'm just sharing an example of how they did that to the qira'at as well. If you use every word if you look at every word in the definition, you're excluding another discipline, right? This is how definitions work. You add more words to exclude more things from being included in the definition. Tafsir is not included, it's not tafsir, it's not grammar, it's not any linguistic science that deals with the Quran. It just focuses on the articulation of certain words in the Quran. Of course, you don't need to talk about the mirror, it's very important, and that has to do with the preservation of the Quran, and therefore it became a communal obligation, fard kifaya, for Muslims to study this ayah. And the way you assess fard kifaya, they said, to maintain the tawatur, to maintain the mass transmission. If it comes to a point that there aren't enough people who know Qur'an, then the Ummah is responsible to preserve this. Not everybody needs to know all the Qur'an, but there has to be always a number of Muslims who study and preserve the different readings of the Qur'an. When you open a book of Qur'an, the subject matter will include discussions of isnad, discussions of the i'rab and linguistics of the Qur'an, discussions of waqf and ibtida, the pause and resume modes, discussions on the positioning of the verse and its end, the fawasil al-ayat. Does the Qur'an have also differences on where the ayah ends and begins? The rasm and the orthography of the mushaf, the isti'adha and the basmala, the takbir that some Qur'an do. From Surah Al-Duha until the end of the Quran, you do takbir between each surah and the other surah. It's famous to Imam Ibn Kathir, Qari. He recites with this sunnah of takbir, say Allahu Akbar, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and then you recite the next surah. Then we have the levels of Qur'an that the Qur'an scholars will assign. There is a beginner Qari, there is a Muqri, there is advanced Qari. It's based on how much knowledge of Qur'an, you know, how many Qur'ans, you know, how many books of Qur'an you study. It's like any other ilm, it became now a discipline and a field that you specialize in, and you get a certain level of mastery and scholarship. Again, these general introductory points, I'm going through them a little bit briefly, and inshallah we'll share the slides with you. And also the scholars mentioned multiple beautiful points of wisdom. Why do we have all this Qur'an? There are things that now will become very obvious to us after all these discussions. So one of which is, of course, the idea of facilitating reading the Quran in an easier way. Again, based on the dialectical diversity of the Arabs and your background, coming from whatever background, Arab and non-Arab, some qira'ahs will be easier for you than others. So if you get the luxury to choose which one you recite, then that will help you memorize the Quran and recite the Quran in a more accurate manner. It accommodated the diversity of the Arabs, and that brought them closer to Islam. Because again, language was really a big deal to them. So if the Quran is honoring me by accommodating my dialect, that might actually, it did attract people to Islam and to believe in the Quran. It honored this ummah, because this is the only scripture that Allah has allowed people to recite a different way. This rukhsa, the harf that we spoke about a lot today, never existed in any other book before. So there is a specific honor that Allah has given this community and ummah through that. It also demonstrates a miraculous aspect about the Quran, that despite these differences, the book wasn't lost. Right? So you see all these efforts that we're talking about today from Abu Bakr and Uthman and the Quran and all of that, that actually was a sign of the miracle of the Quran in a way, or an extension of the miracle of the Quran, that people had flexibility in reciting, but we didn't lose the book. Right? Even though losing the book was possible, rationally, without even the permissibility of reading in different ways. No, the book was there, was already transmitted and written, and even people were allowed to recite in different ways. They had differences about it at some point, but we never lost the book. Muslims collectively worked on preserving the book exactly as it was revealed. It gives you a multiplicity of different opportunities to increase your thawab and reward in reciting the Quran. And then in learning the Quran, we know the hadith, if you struggle learning the Quran, you get thawab, right? And the qira'at offers you different ways of also increasing that reward as well. The idea of no contradiction, that's really important because it proves also the transcendence of the Quran. And then finally, it also helps and give examples that fuqaha, legal scholars, to derive rulings from the Quran. Because if you're not sure whether this hukm, how to understand this ayah, the other qira'ah may help you, right? So that like the arjulikum wa arjulakum, or the idea, the waiting period for divorced women, when the ayah says وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء, for example. And then what's the meaning of qurwa, when the cycle begins to count the number of periods. These kind of multi-dimensional words in the Quran, the qira'at help the legal scholars to come up with answers to these questions. I know we've been going like straight since the break. Inshallah, we should be able to finish around 4:15, 4:30. Do you want 5-minute break, or should we just conclude with examples, inshallah? And no pressure at all. You sure? Okay. So the last thing, I'm gonna say inshallah for any questions. Just to think about the differences. That's the last part of 10. What are the examples we can think about that show the differences in qira'at that impact the meaning? Before we give examples, or before we delve deep into examples, that's a helpful categorization of the qira'at differences that Imam al-Jazari rahimahullah mentioned. He said that there are 3 different levels or different categories of the qira'at differences. He said that sometimes you'll have a difference only in the wording of the ayah with no change in meaning. And we give a lot of examples about that, right? So, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. You can read it صاد, صراط, and you can read it with sin, right? اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. Is it the same word? It's the same word. From like the Arabic dictionary perspective, it's the same exact word. It's the path, right? So change in wording, no impact on me. That's one category. A lot of qira'ats are like that. Right? The second one is, I know I want you to, because like the second and third are kind of overlap a little bit. Wording and meaning differ, but both applicable simultaneously. So there is impact on the meaning, but both are applicable at the same time. You didn't have to say like, yeah, it applies based or it depends. It both can be applicable at the same time. What I mean by that is Maliki Yawmiddin, just as famous examples. Maliki Yawmiddin or Maliki Yawmiddin. Right? What does Malik mean? Owner. If we translate literally. What was Malik? King or sovereign, right? You don't need to say, if you take the meaning to be whatever, then it's owner. If you take that, you don't need to say that. Like both apply at the same time. He is the owner and he is the king, subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It's like both are applicable simultaneously. There's no, and the third one will explain why I'm saying simultaneously. So this is the second category. The third category is wording and meaning differ, but one applies at a time. You can't say like at the same time they mean the same thing. No, now you'll have to deal with it a little bit contextually. So you give an example in Surah Yunus, حتى إذا حتى إذا استيأس الرسل وظنوا أنهم قد كذبوا جاءهم نصرنا, or وظنوا أنهم قد كذبوا. These are two qira'at. The verb كذبوا or كذبوا. Notice by the way the difference is very minor in the shadda or not, but the meaning is different, right? كذبوا from a takdhib, right? And كذبوا from being lied to. So whether you're disbelieving in something or you're deeming something to be lying, it's a little bit different. So if you read it as كذبوا with no shadda, right? So one way to translate it is the messengers despaired and they assumed they were lied to. By the way, it's tricky because like they and they are different days. We're not talking about the same people here. I'll come back to that. If you read it كذبوا, there will be they were certain, not assumed, that they were rejected. Very different meanings. Because you have two issues in addition to the qira'at. One issue is who are they? That's one. There are two days in the surah, in the ayah. And the other one, ظَنُّ. ظَنَّ in the Quran could be assume, and it could be you're certain about something. It actually accommodates both meanings, but it depends on the context. ظَنَّ, the first meaning comes from it is like, yeah, I ظَنَّيت means like I assume, like not all the time. ظَنَّ could be I'm certain about something, right? So here the qira'ah and the context and the tafsir and the other pronouns in the ayah will give you different different meanings. The first one, the messengers despaired and their people thought they were lied to. Meaning their people did not believe in the prophets and they feel like these prophets are lying to us about the idea that Allah will punish us. Right? But the other ayah, it focuses on the prophets themselves, not other people, not other ayah, other qira'ah. Focus on the prophets themselves and the people, that the prophets, they despaired and they were sure that the people rejected them. So literally, haraka in the verb changed the whole context of understanding that. Both meanings are correct, by the way, so that both meanings describe the people and the prophets in a valid way. Both meanings can apply, not at the same time. This is what I mean by the sometimes both apply simultaneously, but sometimes one meaning applies at a time. Is this last example clear?
Can you?
Okay. Yes.
Can you say it again? So because in both times the word also changed, no? Like one time it's like kuzibu and then the next time it's like kuzibu. What do you mean when you're saying that one time only the wording changed and one time only the meaning changed?
No, both change. The wording and the meanings change. But what I'm saying is, the meaning you can understand of both meanings of both qira'at cannot apply at the same time.
Oh, okay, so the both kira will convey two different meanings.
Two different meanings. It's an additional layer of the meaning that adds another meaning that applies to a different context.
I see.
As if this ayah is describing two events. One event is focused on the messengers, and one event is focused on the people of the messengers. Okay, and that's why it involves tafsir and other points as well. Something interesting about the qira'at is that the Quran cares much about brevity, right? It doesn't want to repeat itself, doesn't want to add a lot of verses. Qira'at is a brilliant way of, instead of adding another whole verse or another whole word, which is a lot for the Quran, we'll just add another qira'at. And for example, again, just a hypothetical example, it could be Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin, two ayat, right? Because they're two descriptions of Allah. And that would be valid. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed it like that, that's fine. But the qira'ah saves the repetition of that ayah and just like adds a layer to the meaning. Right? To understand this more, let's think of an example of the Quran repeating something for another purpose. So the kaf or the ijl of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? One surah describes it to be ijl samin. And the other surah, ijl hanif. It's the same ijl, the same kaf, right? One describes it to be like healthy and fat, and the other one describes it to be roasted. Both are valid meanings, right? So he offered the guests, the angels who came to him, meat. One surah tells you it was like a healthy, kind of fat calf, and the other surah tells you, and he roasted it too. Right? It's an additional event, an additional kind of point of detail in the story. But imagine this is not the case. But imagine this to be one ayah with two qira'at. Same ayah, so like some qurra recited samin, some qurra recited han, and that's it. You get the point? So that this is one benefit of the qira'at. Not in this case, because we have two ayat in this case. Same thing about the serpent or the snake of Musa alayhi salam. Right? One ayah describes it as mubin, thu'ban al-mubin, right? Meaning manifest, it's big, it's very, and the other one describes it to be